At 40 degrees below zero, the human body does not die quietly. Your lungs freeze internally on your fourth breath, and the trees around you explode like artillery fire as the water in their trunks turns to expanding ice. In the frozen woodlands of the Northeast during the brutal Little Ice Age of 1643, winter was not simply a cold season that required an extra coat. It was an executioner that hunted down anything weak, unprepared, or rigid enough to stand in its path. If you stepped outside into the howling darkness of the Mohawk River Valley without full protection, the air felt like a physical weight pressing down on your chest, searing your nostrils and draining your core body heat in a matter of minutes. Yet inside a massive structure made of nothing but bent saplings and peeled tree bark, 120 human beings walked barefoot across smooth cedar platforms. Children laughed, elders shared bowls of steaming Sagamite corn soup, and families lounged in light buckskin shirts, while a ferocious Canadian blizzard screamed just inches above their heads. They had no iron radiators, no brick chimneys, no electricity, and no modern synthetic insulation. They were living inside a wooden machine that seemed to defy the fundamental laws of nature. How did the Haudenosaunee build an architectural masterpiece out of flexible saplings that could withstand 40 degrees below zero without collapsing under tons of snow? How did they manage to burn 12 open fire pits continuously inside a 200-foot windowless hall without suffocating every single family inside from smoke or carbon monoxide poisoning? And why did this ancient hall of bark and tension become the physical and spiritual blueprint for one of the most powerful and enduring democracies the Western Hemisphere has ever known? Before we dive deep into the mind-blowing physics of how these bark halls maintained a cozy environment without a single metal bolt, take a quick moment to like this video, drop a comment below telling us which state or country you are watching from, and subscribe our channel right now. In just a few minutes, you are going to see the exact temperature readings recorded inside one of these longhouses by an astonished European scholar during a historic freeze, and the mathematical data will completely change how you view ancient engineering forever. This is the story of the longhouse, a breathing sanctuary built by human hands to conquer the deadliest winters on Earth. The construction of the Great Longhouse began long before the first frost touched the valley, guided by Tekaniwataroken, a master builder of the Mohawk Bear clan whose name translated to two lakes joining. For over 40 years, Tekaniwataroken had studied the grain of the forest, observing how different woods responded to moisture, tension, and freeze-thaw cycles. He knew which saplings could bend into an arch without fracturing, which barks could shed water for 30 years, and how air moved through a curved space when heated by a central flame. To Tekaniwataroken, building a shelter was not an act of dominating the wilderness, but an act of creating a living harmony between human bodies and the physical forces of the earth. Standing beside him on the clearing in the late spring of 1643 was Father Augustin de Bressani, a newly arrived French scholar and Jesuit missionary who had crossed the Atlantic with a mind steeped in European architecture. Father Augustin had been trained in a world of cut granite, heavy oak timber frames, stone fireplaces, and thick mortar walls. When he looked at the site where Tekaniwataroken was laying out the blueprints for a new 220-foot longhouse, he saw nothing more than a childish primitive enclosure. Father Augustin walked along the marked perimeter, tapping the ground with his wooden walking stick and shaking his head in open disbelief. He looked at the slender hickory poles stacked on the grass and scoffed at the idea that such thin materials could protect a community through a northern wilderness winter. He voiced 3 confident predictions of complete disaster to anyone who would listen. First, he declared that a flexible frame made of saplings, no thicker than a man's wrist, would inevitably buckle and collapse under the immense weight of wet autumnal snows. Second, he argued that lighting 10 or 12 open fires inside a completely enclosed bark hall without brick chimneys or glass windows would create a toxic trap that would suffocate every occupant within 48 hours. Third, he insisted that peeled tree bark was far too thin to provide thermal resistance, meaning the interior would become an inescapable icebox the moment Arctic winds swept down from the north. Tekaniwataroken listened to the French scholar's warnings with a calm, patient smile, never stopping his work of testing the flexibility of the green poles. Through a translator, the master builder offered a simple philosophical truth that European builders had forgotten. He explained that stone fortresses and rigid timber houses freeze because they try to fight the winter head-on, creating hard surfaces that wind strips heat from and rigid joints that crack under ice pressure. The longhouse, however, was designed to survive by flowing, flexing, and bending with the storm. Where the European built a fortress to wage war against the weather, the Haudenosaunee built a living arch that welcomed the heat inside and let the gale slide harmlessly over its back. The true engineering of the longhouse did not begin on the building site, but deep within the old-growth forest during a very narrow window of the year. Tekaniwataroken knew that harvesting wood for the main structural arch had to occur strictly during the spring saprise, typically in late May or early June. During these few weeks, the cambium layer beneath the bark flooded with liquid nutrients pulled up from the root systems. This internal moisture pressurized the cellular walls of the saplings, turning the timber into a natural hydraulic spring filled with extraordinary elastic potential energy. If you harvested the same tree in dead winter when the sap was frozen, the wood would be brittle and break under the slightest bend. Tekaniwataroken did not search for the ancient giants of the forest. The massive oaks and thick maples were far too rigid and unyielding for his design. Instead, he sought out the green guardians of the understory, young, slender saplings of bitternut hickory, white cedar, and slippery elm that stood roughly 30 feet tall and measured no more than 3 to 4 inches in diameter at the base. These young trees had spent their lives competing for sunlight beneath the thick canopy above, making them remarkably straight, dense, and supple. Working with methodical precision, the men of the Bear Clan felled over 150 of these selected poles, using polished stone seldas and axes. The harvesting process required a deep understanding of wood mechanics. Strikes had to be delivered at precise 45-degree angles to prevent splintering the long, continuous grain fibers that gave the saplings their tensile strength. Each strike of stone against green wood echoed through the damp spring woods with a wet, heavy thud, signaling the gathering of materials for a home that would shelter 3 generations. Once felled, the saplings were immediately stripped of their outer bark to expose the slick, pale surface of the green wood beneath. The stripped poles felt cool and damp to the touch, releasing a rich aroma of fresh earth and rising sap. Tekaniwataroken inspected every single pole personally, running his hands along the grain to feel for hidden knots, insect borers, or subtle grain twists that might create weak points under heavy load. By keeping the wood green and saturated with natural moisture, the builders preserved the internal wood hydraulics, ensuring that when the time came to pull these 30-foot poles into high arches, the wood would stretch on the outer curve and compress on the inner curve without a single fiber snapping. With the green saplings harvested and inspected, Tekaniwataroken began laying out the structural foundation for the 220-foot longhouse. He established 2 perfectly straight, parallel lines, spaced exactly 22 feet apart, orienting the long central axis of the building slightly off the path of the prevailing northwest winter winds. Along these 2 parallel lines, the young men dug a series of deep post holes, 4 feet into the heavy clay soil, spaced at precise 6-foot intervals. Into these deep sockets, they drove the butt ends of the 30-foot hickory saplings, packing them tightly with river gravel and damp clay to create rigid vertical posts that resisted lateral movement. Then came the most dramatic and physically demanding phase of construction, bending the skeleton into place. Men climbed onto elevated timber scaffolding erected along the central aisle. Working in synchronized teams of 4, they reached out, grabbed the flexible tops of opposing sapling poles, and began pulling them slowly toward the center. As the green poles gave way, the wood moaned under the immense internal stress, storing mechanical potential energy in every continuous grain fiber. The poles curved gracefully inward, meeting at the apex 20 feet above the ground to form a smooth, parabolic arch. This arched geometry was not merely decorative. It was a masterclass in pre-stressed structural engineering. By forcing the green saplings into a state of permanent bending tension, Tekaniwataroken transformed individual flexible poles into a unified, high-strength structural vault. The inherent outward push of the bent wood balanced the inward pull of the lashings, creating an elastic frame that could easily support up to 55 pounds of wet snow load per square foot. When weight was applied to the top of the arch, the load was distributed down the continuous curve to the ground, rather than concentrating on a single weak joint. To lock this pre-stressed frame together, the builders used long, wet cords harvested from the fibrous inner bark of the basswood tree. They soaked these strips in river water before wrapping them tightly around every overlapping joint in a continuous crisscross pattern. As these basswood lashings dried over the following 3 weeks, they underwent a natural shrinkage process, contracting by 15 to 18% of their wet length. This intense shrinkage pulled the wooden joints together with immense force, clamping the green saplings so tightly that the frame became as rigid as if it had been fastened with iron bolts, creating an unbroken skeleton that resembled the hollow, arched rib cage of a giant whale. With the arched wooden skeleton standing complete against the sky, the focus shifted to harvesting and preparing the protective skin that would enclose the hull. For this vital layer, Tekaniwataroken relied exclusively on the bark of mature red elm trees. Elm bark was uniquely suited for northern survival because of its remarkable chemical composition and structural density. The outer cork layer contained high concentrations of natural suberin and tannins, rendering it completely waterproof, resistant to rot, and unpalatable to wood-boring insects. The inner bast layer consisted of long, interwoven cellulose fibers that provided exceptional tensile strength and thermal insulation. Harvesting these massive bark sheets required delicate skill to ensure the trees were not killed in the process. Working during the peak of the spring sap flow, when the cambium layer was wet and slippery, the harvesters made clean horizontal cuts around the base and upper trunk of the tree, followed by a single vertical slice down the side. Using flattened wooden wedges carved from hardwood, they gently pried the bark away from the trunk. Large, continuous sheets measuring 6 feet wide by 8 feet long peeled away with a satisfying tearing sound, revealing the glistening, moisture-rich wood beneath. Freshly peeled elm bark, however, presented a serious engineering challenge. As the raw sheets lost moisture in the air, the uneven shrinkage between the dense outer cork and the fibrous inner bast caused the bark to curl into useless, tight cylinders. To prevent this, Tekaniwataroken established a large-scale curing press on a level stretch of ground near the village. The wet sheets were laid out flat in overlapping rows, alternating between bark face and wood face. Heavy river stones and massive oak logs were then piled on top of the stack, creating hundreds of pounds of downward pressure that forced the bark to dry in perfectly flat panels over a 3-week period. If you are enjoying this deep dive into ancient building science and want to help us share more forgotten survival stories, please hit the like button right now. Drop a comment below, telling us what surprises you most about this bark curing process, and subscribe our channel. Coming up in the next section, we are going to explore how the Haudenosaunee created a natural vacuum inside this hall that pulled smoke straight out of the roof without using a single electric fan, so make sure you stay tuned for that fascinating breakdown. Once the elm bark panels were fully flat and cured, the assembly of the longhouse's protective envelope began. The builders hoisted the heavy bark panels up the exterior of the bent sapling frame, positioning them horizontally in overlapping courses, starting from the ground level and working their way up toward the roofline. This shingling technique mimicked the natural arrangement of fish scales or pinecone scales. Every upper sheet overlapped the sheet below it by at least 8 inches, ensuring that heavy autumn rains and winter snowmelt would slide smoothly down the exterior without ever finding a seam to penetrate the interior. To secure these massive sheets against the fierce winds of the Mohawk Valley, Tekaniwataroken implemented a brilliant double-frame clamping design. Once the first layer of bark was positioned against the primary interior skeleton, a second, exterior set of sapling poles was placed directly over the bark on the outside of the building. These outer poles aligned perfectly with the inner ribs, and were lashed down tightly using dried basswood cords that passed through small, sealed punctures in the bark seams. This effectively sandwiched the elm bark sheets between two complete wooden skeletons, preventing the wind from catching the edges of the bark panels and ripping them free during severe gales. This double-frame construction technique accidentally created another massive thermal advantage: a trapped air cavity between the inner bark lining and the outer clamping poles. Because the bark did not sit completely flush against every contour of the sapling ribs, small dead air spaces measuring 3 to 4 inches deep were created throughout the wall assembly. Still air is one of the finest natural thermal insulators in existence, providing an additional insulation value of roughly R3/5 across the entire surface area of the building. This dead air layer prevented cold exterior winds from drawing heat directly out of the inner bark skin through convective cooling. Furthermore, this complete curved structure possessed extraordinary aeroelastic flexibility. When winter gales exceeding 50 miles per hour slammed into the side of the 220-foot hall, the building did not stand rigid and resist the force like a stone wall. Instead, the entire structure swayed up to 6 inches, absorbing the kinetic energy of the wind across hundreds of flexible lashed joints before gently springing back into its original position. The rounded profile allowed the gale to glide over and around the building with minimal drag, turning a potential structural hazard into a harmless atmospheric breeze. Stepping inside the fully enclosed shell of the completed longhouse revealed a vast, cavernous tunnel stretching 220 feet into the dim interior. Running down the exact geometric center of the packed clay floor was a straight row of 12 excavated fire pits, spaced at precise 18-foot intervals. Each of these hearths was shared by 2 families living directly opposite one another across the central aisle. While lighting 12 open fires inside a windowless wooden enclosure would seem like a recipe for instant suffocation to a European builder, Tekaniwataroken had engineered a passive airflow management design that handled smoke with incredible scientific efficiency. Directly above each of the 12 hearth pits, the builders had cut a large rectangular hatch, measuring roughly 2 feet by 3 feet, through the apex of the arched bark roof. These hatches functioned as the vital nostrils of the longhouse, allowing hot air and combustion gases to escape into the atmosphere. On the exterior of the roof, fitted beside each hatch, was a large, movable bark flap mounted on a long wooden control pole that extended down to the living area below. By adjusting these poles from the floor, the occupants could alter the angle and position of the roof flaps in response to changing weather conditions outside. The physics behind this ventilation setup relied on Bernoulli's principle and the Venturi effect. When winter winds blew across the curved roof of the longhouse, the occupants angled the exterior bark flap 15 degrees away from the direction of the wind. As the wind sped up over the raised edge of the flap, it created a localized zone of negative air pressure directly above the roof opening. This pressure differential created a gentle, continuous suction force that actively pulled smoke up and out of the building at a rate of roughly 4 feet per second, completely eliminating stagnant smoke without requiring any mechanical fans or forced drafts. This constant upward velocity of warm air created another unexpected benefit during winter storms. It made the roof openings completely impervious to falling snow. As heavy snowflakes drifted down toward the open smoke hatches, the powerful upward column of thermal energy and rising air current repelled the snow, pushing it away from the opening and forcing it to land harmlessly on the sloped bark roof instead. Even during the most intense blizzards, when feet of snow accumulated on the surrounding forest floor, the 12 smoke hatches of the longhouse remained clear, open, and fully functional. Despite the continuous extraction of smoke through the 12 roof hatches, not all of the warm smoke escaped the building, and that was a crucial part of Tekaniwataroken's thermal strategy. Because the longhouse featured a high, 20-foot arched ceiling, a thick, stable layer of warm gray smoke settled in the upper third of the vault, hovering roughly 8 feet above the living floor. This smoke ceiling acted as a massive thermal blanket, trapping the rising heat from the 12 fires and reflecting infrared radiant energy back down toward the people sitting on the platforms below. The air temperature within this upper smoke layer remained at a warm 32 degrees Celsius or 90 degrees Fahrenheit, throughout the cold months. The Haudenosaunee transformed this hot, smoke-filled upper zone into a massive food preservation ecosystem. Hanging from the rafters, completely submerged within the warm smoke blanket, were thousands of braided seed corn ears, bags of dried bush beans, smoked fish, and strips of venison. The continuous exposure to warm wood smoke cured the food supplies, prevented mold growth, and rendered the dried provisions completely unpalatable to insects and rodents that might otherwise have ruined the clan's winter survival rations. Simultaneously, the longhouse featured another clever subsystem, located at ground level, the wood-baking storage zone beneath the sleeping platforms. Firewood harvested from the forest often carried high moisture levels, sometimes containing over 30% water by weight. Burning damp wood is notoriously inefficient, as a huge portion of the fire's energy is wasted simply boiling off internal water rather than radiating heat into the room. To solve this, the Haudenosaunee stacked all their split hardwood logs directly underneath the raised sleeping benches, just a few feet away from the active central hearths. In this sheltered, low-bench area, the radiant heat from the nearby fire pits slowly baked the stored firewood, raising the temperature of the logs to over 43 degrees Celsius, or 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Over several weeks of storage beneath the benches, the wood's internal moisture content dropped from 32% down to an optimal 11%. When this preheated bone-dry wood was placed onto the hearth, it ignited instantly and burned with intense, clean heat, boosting the energy output from 4,200 BTUs per pound up to a massive 7,200 BTUs per pound, ensuring maximum fuel efficiency. While the 12 central fires provided the primary heat source for the longhouse, the structure's floor presented a persistent cold challenge. Because the ground level consisted of packed clay in direct contact with the frozen earth below, the floor temperature hovered at a chilly 2 to 4 degrees Celsius, or 35 to 39 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold air, being denser than warm air, pooled along the ground in a continuous, low-lying current. If the occupants had slept directly on the earth floor, their body heat would have been rapidly drained through direct conduction into the ground. To elevate the clan above this ground-level cold zone, Tekaniwataroken designed a continuous two-tier bench framework running along both interior walls for the entire length of the building. Constructed from sturdy cedar poles, these wide benches were raised 18 inches off the dirt floor, positioning the living and sleeping areas squarely within the primary thermal comfort zone created by the fires. The benches were layered first with thick mats woven from dry corn husks, followed by deep stacks of oily, high-density furs harvested from black bears, beavers, and white-tailed deer, creating an insulated sleeping platform with an equivalent value of R12. Furthermore, the longhouse operated as a massive metabolic engine powered by the human bodies living inside it. A resting human adult generates approximately 420 BTUs of radiant body heat every hour through normal metabolic processes. With 120 clan members living inside the sealed 220-foot hall, the collective human presence generated a constant 50,400 BTUs per hour of passive body warmth. This biological heat output was contained so effectively by the insulated bark skin that the occupant's body heat alone raised the baseline interior air temperature by 8 degrees Celsius, or 14 degrees Fahrenheit, before a single log was ever lit in the hearths. If you are fascinated by how ancient cultures used natural physics to survive extreme environments, please take a quick second to hit the like button, subscribe our channel, and leave a comment below with your thoughts. In the next part of our story, the ultimate test arrives as a record-shattering Canadian blizzard hits the valley, driving temperatures down to a lethal 40 below zero, and you will see what happened when a French missionary was forced to compare his failing timber frame house with this ancient bark hall. The true test of Tekaniwataroken's creation arrived in early January 1644, when a historical Arctic air mass dropped out of northern Canada and settled over the Mohawk River Valley. The weather shifted in a matter of hours. The wind roared out of the northwest at 50 miles per hour, driving a wall of blinding white snow before it. By midnight, the ambient outdoor temperature had plummeted to a lethal 40 degrees below zero, both Celsius and Fahrenheit. It was the kind of atmospheric crisis that occurs only a few times in a century. A deep freeze so intense that exposed skin froze solid in less than 60 seconds, and native wildlife perished in their burrows. 4 miles down the valley, at the newly constructed European trading post and mission station, Father Augustin de Bressani was experiencing a desperate, life-threatening nightmare inside his own dwelling. Father Augustin's house had been built according to the finest European carpentry standards of the era. Square timber framing, thick oak plank siding, and a massive central stone chimney mortared with local lime. Yet, faced with the fury of a -40-degree blizzard, every single element of the European building began to fail in rapid succession. The first failure occurred at the square corners of the building. The rigid timber joints, having expanded and contracted through the damp autumn months, had developed microscopic gaps. The 50-mile-per-hour wind forced Arctic air through these corner seams like a pressurized nozzle, creating freezing drafts that blew candles out across the room. Next, the massive stone chimney suffered a catastrophic structural breakdown. The intense heat of the roaring fireplace caused the interior stones to expand rapidly, while the exterior stones remained frozen at 40 below zero. This extreme thermal shock cracked the lime mortar, causing the chimney flue to backdraft and filling the living quarters with blinding, choking smoke. To make matters worse, Father Augustin's firewood supply, which had been stacked outside under a canvas tarp, was frozen solid and coated in thick ice. When the frozen logs were thrown into the hearth, they hissed, sputtered, and produced thick clouds of steam instead of heat, consuming energy just trying to thaw out. Within 12 hours, the temperature inside the European timber house plunged to 5 degrees below 0 Celsius, or 23 degrees Fahrenheit. Water pails froze solid beside the hearth, ink froze in the missionary's well, and Father Augustine realized that staying in his European house meant dying of hypothermia before morning. Wrapping himself in his heavy wool cloak, he stumbled out into the whiteout, following the tree line toward the longhouse. Fighting his way through knee-deep snowdrifts in the blinding whiteout, Father Augustine finally reached the northern end of the Bear Clan's longhouse. Shivering uncontrollably, his fingers numb and his face white with frostbite, he pushed aside the heavy, double-layered bear hide door curtain and stepped through the low entrance tunnel. The moment the thick hide fell shut behind him, the roaring chaos of the blizzard vanished, replaced by an extraordinary, reverent silence. Father Augustine stood frozen in astonishment at the scene before him. Stretching out for more than 200 feet was a dimly lit, glowing sanctuary of warmth and life. Along the central aisle, 12 small fires burned with clean, golden flames, sending thin, straight columns of smoke straight up into the high ceiling. At eye level, the air was remarkably clear, warm and scented with dried sweetgrass, pine resin, and roasting meat. On the raised benches along both walls, clan members sat comfortably in light buckskin garments. Women were sewing moccasins, elders were softly chanting ancient stories, and young children played on bearskin mats without a single shiver. Reaching into his leather travel satchel with trembling, thawing hands, Father Augustine pulled out his prized scientific instrument, a brass-cased European mercury thermometer he had brought from France to record weather observations in the New World. Determined to understand the reality of what he was experiencing, he began taking precise temperature readings at various points throughout the building. Outside the bark wall, the mercury sat frozen at the bottom of the scale at -40 degrees. Moving his instrument to the dirt floor near the entrance, he recorded 4 degrees Celsius, or 39 degrees Fahrenheit. Then, Father Augustine stepped up onto the primary cedar sleeping platform, 18 inches off the floor, and held the thermometer at waist level. The red liquid inside the glass tube rose steadily, settling at a comfortable 18 degrees Celsius, or 64 degrees Fahrenheit. When he raised the instrument high above his head into the upper rafters, it registered 32 degrees Celsius, or 90 degrees Fahrenheit. The total temperature differential between the freezing gale outside and the living platforms inside was a staggering 58 degrees Celsius, or 104 degrees Fahrenheit, maintained entirely by bent saplings, flat elm bark, 12 small fires, and human body warmth. Pulling out his leather-bound journal, the humbled scholar began calculating the resource efficiency of what he was witnessing. His own European timber mission house had burned through 3.5 cords of hardwood per family per month, only to maintain an unlivable interior temperature just barely above freezing. The Haudenosaunee longhouse, by contrast, consumed just 0.8 of a cord of wood per family per month to maintain a stable, spring-like climate across 60 feet of living space, a 77% reduction in firewood consumption per capita. Sitting beside Tekaniwataroken's hearth, Father Augustin wrote a single line in his journal that surrendered all his European biases. "We came to teach these people how to build civilization, but tonight, in the deep of the forest, it is they who have taught us how to live." The extraordinary survival efficiency of the longhouse was not merely a matter of physical comfort. It was the foundation upon which the Haudenosaunee built their entire political and social civilization. The physical structure of the longhouse was a direct embodiment of the Great Law of Peace, or Iroquois, the oral constitution that united 5 formerly warring nations, the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, into a powerful democratic confederacy. Just as a physical longhouse gathered dozens of families under a single protective roof, the Confederacy treated the entire territory, stretching from the Hudson River to the Niagara River, as one giant, metaphorical longhouse, where all nations shared the same symbolic hearth fire. Living together inside an unpartitioned 200-foot hall required a deep, organized commitment to social harmony and mutual respect. In a space where 20 families shared the same air, the same food reserves, and the same fires, private conflict was a threat to collective survival. The architecture itself taught the people empathy, active listening, and compromise from early childhood. You could not isolate yourself behind a locked wooden door when trouble arose. You had to sit across the shared fire, look your neighbor in the eye, and resolve disputes through peaceful counsel, guided by the wisdom of the elders. At the heart of this domestic democracy stood the immense political authority of the clan mothers, led by matriarchs like chimneys of the Bear Clan. In Haudenosaunee culture, lineage and property rights passed exclusively through the female line. The longhouse belonged to the women. The clan mothers managed the distribution of stored food reserves, assigned family living spaces along the bench platforms, and maintained order within the home. More importantly, the clan mothers held ultimate political authority over the nation's leaders. It was the women who selected the male chiefs to represent the clan in the Great Council, and if a chief acted dishonorably, showed aggression, or failed to serve the people, the clan mothers possessed the sole constitutional power to strip him of his title and return him to private life. This living house was also designed with a profound respect for the natural life cycle of the earth. A longhouse was maintained and repaired lovingly for 20 to 30 years, as worn bark sheets were replaced and lashed joints were tightened every spring. But when the surrounding farm fields eventually lost their fertility and firewood became scarce, the community made a conscious choice to move. They dismantled the hall, taking their precious wampum belts, tools, and woven mats with them, leaving the old timber skeleton to decompose naturally on the forest floor. Within a few seasons, the decaying wood enriched the soil, giving birth to a new, vibrant forest where the longhouse had once stood, leaving no permanent scars upon the earth. As the third night of the great blizzard settled over the Mohawk Valley, Father Augustin sat quietly on the fur-covered cedar bench beside Tekaniwataroken's hearth. The French missionary accepted a carved wooden bowl of warm corn soup, offered to him by clan mother Katniss, his hands now completely warm and his heart humbled. Looking down the long, glowing 220-foot hall, he watched 3 generations of families resting peacefully, their voices blending softly above the gentle crackle of the hearths, while the deadly 40-below-zero storm raged harmlessly against the bark walls above. In that quiet, sacred moment, the true lesson of the longhouse became clear. Human greatness is not achieved by erecting cold stone monuments to conquer and dominate the natural world, but by having the wisdom to bend with the wind, listen to the earth, and build a shared sanctuary where no one is left out in the cold. Though the ancient elm bark halls of the Haudenosaunee have long since returned to the forest soil, Their enduring flame still burns brightly today. They remind us that the ultimate shelter has never been built from iron, stone, or modern technology, but from flexibility, community, and the timeless truth that we survive the coldest winters only when we learn to share the same fire.